Good evening and welcome at the Morgan. I am Isabelle Dervaux, Acquavella Curator and Department Head in Modern and Contemporary Drawings at the Morgan. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, the artist George Condo, who is the subject of an exhibition of drawings in our Thor Gallery upstairs, which will officially open tomorrow and remain on view through May 14. George Condo emerged on the New York art scene in the early 1980s and has been a major figure in the international contemporary art world ever since. He's known primarily as a painter. Many of his paintings are in museums all over the world. He's also a sculptor. Many of you are probably familiar with the spectacular gilt sculpture that has been standing on the terrace of the Metropolitan Opera's facade since 2019. But George is also an avid and prolific draftsman, which is the aspect of his career that we will be discussing more specifically tonight. Rather than giving a long introduction, I think we should just dive in. Since the drawings in the exhibition were done over a period of 45 years, that will give us an opportunity to talk about George's entire career. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here tonight and for agreeing to enlighten us.
Thank everybody. Thank you all. Thank you.
So we're opening with a photo of you at the age of 18, which is the age you had when you made the earliest drawings in the exhibition.
And I still have that suit.
And so here are the drawings. So this is the opportunity. Why don't you tell us how you started, and before discussing those specific drawings, maybe how you decided to become an artist, etc.
Well, I started very early, when I was maybe 4 or so, and I started making drawings, and actually the photograph is from when I was about 17 and a half, I realized, because I was born in December, and so my parents put me into school when I was 4 and a half at first grade, and what I did was I couldn't answer any of the questions, so I just drew dinosaurs and drawings, and I thought if I made nice drawings, maybe the teacher would pass me. And finally she said, she showed the class and she told me to come up, and I sat on her lap and I gave her a kiss. And she called my mother and said, he's a bit too young. So I had to repeat the first grade. And then that began the sort of inferiority complex, which drove me to becoming an artist and very introspective. So during that time, I started drawing and drawing and drawing and reading and reading and reading, and got more and more into art. And by the time I was about 16, I considered myself sort of an abstract realist. And these were sort of 2 drawings from notebooks. The one on the left was that one there is from 75, and it's a real all-over kind of experience, with drawings of just shapes and forms and a continuum of ideas about sort of what's going through your head, and then the next one was called Entrance to the Mind, and those titles later I came to find journals from that period of time, which is how I was able to trace the drawings to the titles. And they took me 10 years until I was able to finally start to use those drawings in paintings.
I'll get to that, but you already were familiar with Cubism then, and art history.
I was, like I say, I had read a lot of, at one point, I'd read Gertrude Stein's book on Picasso. I understood, I read the book on the spiritual and art by Kandinsky. I'd been reading quite a bit about abstract painting and about abstract art. And also, this is before I went to college. And so when I went to college, the idea was that I wanted to study art history to understand more about it. And I'd also been studying classical music at the same time. So they were very much kind of my idea about when you look at a Jackson Pollock painting and you're not supposed to see figures or faces. I thought, I do. When I look at those things, I see figures and I see faces and I see those kind of things. So I started thinking, I want to draw the figures and faces and things that I see in these abstract paintings and actually realize what it is that I'm looking at.
So the reason these drawings are important is not just sort of for the anecdote because you made them when you were so young, but it's because they in fact turn out to be precursor of quite a number of other works. So here, about 10 years later, as you were starting,
Yeah.
you did what you call the expanding canvas.
Yeah.
So do you want to elaborate on those?
Well, the expanding canvases were the extension of those drawings where I was finally able to realize that idea of just an all-over painting and at the same time have it comprised of figures and forms that were sort of based on art historical things, like whether it was Gorky, whether it was Pollock, anything that I loved in art, I wanted to incorporate into my own paintings. And I wanted it to be a stream of conscious. Coming from where I come from, which is a town next to Lowell, Massachusetts, which is where I went to school, that's where Jack Kerouac was from. And his whole writing was kind of automatic writing. And so I thought a lot about automatic painting, where you don't revise what it is that you paint. That when you're on a canvas, when you're in a drawing, you can erase, you can redraw, you can do this, you can do that. And I didn't on those two earlier ones. But then I wanted to continue that into the point, into the canvas itself on the painting.
So already we see a sort of ambiguity between what's a drawing and what's a painting for you. These are paintings, but they look like drawings.
Yeah, they're drawings on canvas. I actually wanted to break down the hierarchy between the importance of drawing or painting, because I always felt that drawing was just as important as paintings, like the drawings of Raphael, drawings of Ingres, the drawings of them. The drawings of Picasso in his neoclassic period. I always felt like all of those drawings were no less important than the paintings themselves. And I thought, then why can't paintings be drawings just as much as drawings can be paintings?
Right. So I brought another one from the same series because, so this one is called Dancing 2 Miles, and I thought that would be a good opportunity for you to mention also the importance of music from the start.
Music, having studied classical music and then tried to play jazz, which is very difficult for a classical musician to transition into jazz, I started to realize how utterly complex jazz was. And the complexity, but also the improvisational aspects of jazz based on motifs, format, of the music itself. So I based this on the idea of Miles Davis's music from some of his later albums. And I did have the opportunity to meet Miles Davis at one point, and thankfully, one of my friends that's here that came down to New York with me from Boston, Mark Dagley, who's a great abstract painter, I said to Mark, hey, could you go back and grab that catalog with Dancing to Miles so I can show it to Miles Davis? So he went up to my apartment, he grabbed the book, which this was in my show at Barbara Gladstone's gallery in 1984 or 5, and I showed it to Miles, and he really liked it a lot, invited me down to dinner with his whole family and everybody, and we sat and talked about painting and music and the relationships between painting and music the whole time. That was a great thing for me, to meet one of my idols.
It's actually through music that you first met Jean-Michel Basquiat, isn't it? You were in a band, and he was a clarinetist.
Well, we were in the band, Mark and I were both in the same band. We were in the Girls, and we were in Boston. And we came down and we played in, I think it was 79 or 80, at a club called Tier 3. And Jean-Michel was in a band called Gray. And so I went up, and he was tinkering with little things on the stage, sort of electronic things. And I asked him what he was doing. And he told me, and then we started this conversation. And I said, "What do you do?" And he said he was an artist. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm an artist too." And so he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Boston." And he said, "You're never going to sell a single painting in Boston. You should move to New York." So after he told me I should move to New York, I said to Mark, I said, "I think we should move to New York. I mean, we're never going to make it in Boston. Nothing's going to ever happen." And so it was thanks to Jean Michel that I moved to New York. He's the first guy I ever met there in New York. And we had a conversation about electronic music because his band was kind of thinking a lot about electronic music. And I had been moving from, say, Bach fugues and John Dowland and Renaissance music and lute music into more contemporary Italian music like Luciano Berio's sequenzas and people like Mario Davidovsky and whatever. And a lot of that was incorporated into the music that we were doing. And it was a kind of an art punk music-oriented situation. So, and that's what they were doing as well. So anyway, that's how I got here.
Yeah.
Thanks to Jean Michel.
That's important. And so just one more to show that, in fact, this trend, this way of working, you continued, because here is a work from 2001, also in this same idea of the expanding canvas.
Yeah.
So, but let's move now. We are 1985, and you are moving to Paris, where you are going to live for about 10 years. What was the attraction, and why did you go to Paris? Why did you stay there? What did you do there?
Well, I'd been reading so much French literature, okay? I'd been reading a lot of Céline, I'd been reading Sartre, I'd been reading all kinds of books by various different writers, Gilles Deleuze, his book that he did with Guattari on Bacon, all these kind of books, and in English translations, obviously. And I had this romantic idea about Paris being the place where that kind of existential literature comes from, as well as the shimmering glow of the light of Monet and the sort of effervescence of sort of Renoir's landscapes. And I just thought Paris was the place for me. And also the fact that Picasso had moved there from Spain, and I wanted to get closer and closer to why all of this movement of Matisse, Picasso, Wangri, Braque, Léger, all of these artists that I had an affinity with in terms of what I felt like, I don't know, somehow structurally in my work would make sense. But I also wanted to incorporate the way they did, where I think that, when Picasso painted a painting like Demoiselle d'Avignon, he was thinking a lot about Cézanne and about the bathers. And I think that he had just basically sort of, taken that concept into his work and applied his own new ideas about the collection of African art that Braque had been collecting and that he started collecting, and collaging together these two cultural I guess you could call them distances and similarities, to the extent that one could say you would learn a lot more by looking at African sculpture about Picasso than you do about African sculpture by looking at Picasso, which is kind of interesting. You look at an African sculpture at the Met or wherever they have a great sculpture, and you say, "Oh, it looks so much like Picasso." And you look at Picasso and it doesn't tell you anything about that form of art. And I thought that was a curiously interesting thing. So in my case, what I started to do was abstract in the language of sort of more the American sort of, de Kooning and people that were dealing with things that led me to paintings and drawings like the one on the right, left, and the one on the right, back in Paris. And the back in Paris drawing was, I'd been sick and tired of living in Paris at that point. And
the romantic aspect just wore off.
I got back to Paris and I thought I didn't really have a place to live in New York. And by the way, the painting Dancing to Miles was done at Keith Haring's studio on one of his canvases. I was living in Paris at that time and I didn't have a studio, and Keith was coming to Paris and working in my studio. And when I came to New York, he said, "Well, you can take one of my tarpaulins and work on it." So I did that in his studio. And so at that point, I got, sort of back in touch with my friends, Keith, Jean-Michel, Warhol, and all these guys. And I got back in Paris, and I felt isolated. So the back in Paris drawing was more of a kind of a cage and an isolated sort of madman, back in Paris again. So that's why it's called Back in Paris.
And it's a screaming figure, yeah. And in terms of Picasso, you've moved away really from Cubism in these works and more toward his paintings from the late 20s, 30s, the distorted bathers, etc.
Yeah, all his periods are amazing, and every one of them has something to do with periods that took place before that. I think, it doesn't matter whether it's neoclassicist period, all has to do with drawings of Ingres, or it has to do with, Greek classicism. Apparently, what he had was Zervos has cataloged all of Picasso's work, but he also did massive volumes of Greek classical sculptures. And Picasso did have all those incredible, massive, volumes of Greek, classical sculptures, Roman, Greek classical sculptures, and he worked from them on those works. So in any case, any one of his periods of work taught me that you can go back in time. And also I had listened to a lecture once on YouTube by Glenn Gould, and he says that the genius of Bach was that he was 400 years behind his time. and I thought that was a great comment, because his sons, Johann Christian were more popular than he was during his lifetime. But it was infinitely more exciting to listen to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, obviously, because he drew so much on the past. And so in any case, I thought, destruction of chronology and linearity in art was a mission to a certain degree, that from an artistic perspective, I could use Franz Hals and Franz Klein in the same painting. There's no rule that says you can't do that.
So another example of your mixing painting and drawings, this is a painting, which is at MoMA, but made of a whole bunch of drawings that you glued on the...
Yeah, I'd done the central figure, and it was with a white background. It was in my apartment in Paris, and I was just contemplating forever what to do with the background. And I did all the drawings on sheets of paper in a hotel room that I was living in Paris at the Hotel Loti. And I had all the drawings, and I just thought to myself, maybe each drawing individually is one thing, but perhaps they would add up to a sort of I don't know what, like a mindscape again, or a sort of, rather than just say a blue sky with clouds or some sort of gray background or whatever, that I'd keep it like a painting combined with drawings once again.
Right, and this started all those salon-style installations that are favored in your exhibitions, right? You pointed the way.
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving to, one of the things that everybody knows about George's work is he's extremely eclectic. And so another trend, another aspect, also going back to the beginning, because in fact the painting which you consider your first mature painting is the one called the Madonna, which is here, which you have also called a fake Tiepolo, or fake Old Master. And so I'm bringing it just to see where a drawing like Hand Study, which is in the exhibition, sort of comes from, or to what aspect of George's work it belongs. So what was the idea to sort of redo Old Masters?
I think it has to do with that Glenn Gould thing. I didn't know about that until just like last year. I saw that on YouTube. But I wanted to go back in time and think all the work that was happening during the early 80s and 82 when I did the painting of the Madonna was all a sort of new image art where there was a lot of images on a single canvas. And I thought, somehow you've got to take one image and incorporate all these different time zones into a single painting, like the sort of interchangeability of various languages in painting and try to put them together in one image. And I thought, what is one of the most iconic images that everybody, you have to think of an image that everyone would recognize. And I thought, well, a Madonna, everybody knows a Madonna, what a Madonna is. And how can you take something like that? And it's very much against, in a strange way, the practice of someone like Picasso, to go back into, maybe during, when he was, I don't know what, 10 years old or 12 years old, he was starting with classicism, but then he moved so far away from it that I wanted to go back and go sort of anti-Picasso. I wanted to go anti-art. I wanted to go anti-everything. And I also thought a lot about, having spent a year working at Warhol's factory just as a diamond duster, I thought, what can I come back to New York with that will be unique? And it won't be something new. It'll be something extremely old. And in order to come back to something that feels different, it would seem like you look at it, it's varnished, I scraped the face with a ruler so that what was behind, I'd painted in their face, and I thought it was painted in pretty well, but not good enough. So I took a ruler and I just scraped it across, and it became sort of like a Francis Bacon type experience in the midst of an old master painting. And so the hands were done, I think, in 92?
94.
94. And so I came back around like many years later, like I work cyclically, so that I came back around to the idea of, and these are just studies of the artist's hands, and I thought, I can use these studies and start practicing once again. I did work from models for a long time, but I spent too much time sort of asking them if they want a cup of tea or if it's like this or like that. And I thought, most of the time I'm saying, is it too much to sit in one place for too long and all of that? And then I just finally decided the best way to work from realism is to just memorize it and then keep it in the back of your brain and sort of regenerate it somehow photographically in your mind, print out what you see in your head. So in this case, I didn't do that. I just decided to look at my hands and draw them. And I thought a lot about Schongauer, thought a lot about Dürer, I thought a lot about the way that technique works on this sort of colored tone paper. And then I used it for the painting.
And then, yes, it was also really a study for various paintings, including something like this, the psychoanalytical puppeteer losing his mind.
Yeah. So those drawings added up to being very useful for these kind of paintings because I wanted to work with hand gestures in paintings, and I thought a lot about how do you identify artists, in terms of I don't know what you want to call it, signature hands. Let's just say an El Greco just by looking at the way the hands are painted. A Modigliani by the way the hands are painted. And so I thought hands are very important, and that it's one of the more challenging things, I think, for younger artists to deal with. And so I wanted to kind of get through that and then be able to use them in paintings where I had a better idea about, what the sort of overall concept of the painting was going to be. So the psychoanalytical puppeteer losing his mind is a guy who has, and Salman Rushdie wrote a text about it, which is kind of cool. Salman did this whole chapter on it. And it's really about, you see these strings hanging from the top of the canvas, and then he's got some strings sort of falling from his hands, and then there's a puppet sort of running away from him. So he's sort of lost, he's been released from some higher being, and then he's lost his control over.
So how did the painting ended up in Salman Rushdie's novel? He saw it?
I mean, yeah. I was in a dinner with Salman Rushdie and a few writers at Andrew Wiley's house out in the Hamptons, and Andrew is his literary agent. And so he had and he said, you should maybe ask Salman Rushdie to look at some of your work and write about, when I paint an imaginary portrait, I think there's a life before the painting stops. It's like a photograph, and people have a life before a photograph, which is a frozen image, and then there's a life of that person after. But it takes a real literary genius to sort of come in and describe what is the life of that figure. Who is that person? Who was that person? Who is that person? And where did that person go? And that was that's how we got it. I had
So he
given
saw
him
the
the image.
painting
I
in
gave
your
him the image.
Oh, you
I
didn't
gave him
see
a
it in
picture
your
of
studio.
the painting,
Yeah.
and I didn't know if he was going to do anything with it or not. He did not give me credit, but that's fine, because he told me when he handed me the book Fury, he said it's the chapter in italics. It's all about that one painting, the psychoanalytical, puppeteer.
Okay, so moving to another drawing in the exhibition that is a study for a painting. The guy with the cape, the figure with the cape. So you want to tell us what this painting is about, or what the drawing is about?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, the drawing is a study, obviously, for the painting, and it could have been done while I was working on the painting. Quite often, while I'm working on a painting, I have to, look at the painting and start to work on drawings, and to be able to complete the painting and get the folds of the fabric, or figure out where the figure is, or what they're holding, and this and that. So these are part of a series of the kind of based on the idea of the artificial realism idea that I had come up with, and I'd written a whole text about it. And I thought, artificial realism, Robert Rosenblum came up to me once in the, I don't know when it was, and anyway, he said, what do you call what you do? And I thought, he said, it's not neo-surrealism, it's not this, it's not that. What would you say it is? And I thought a lot about it, and I said, I guess you could call it artificial realism. And he said, what is that? And I said, it's the realistic representation of that which is artificial. And that strange little concept, unfortunately, became a sort of political bomb, which we now live with, which is the realistic representation of that which is artificial, otherwise known as the fake news and everything that we're told out there, which is a sort of, it's a political, it's an equation, you know what I mean? The idea of artificial realism, because reality in its own definition is that which exists external to us, independent of our perception. And so I thought, and then also artificial, if you look at the definition of the word artificial, it says man-made. So I thought, so if I want to be a realist, I have to paint things that are somewhat man-made. And so I started to think in an industrialist manner of how to construct figures that are somewhat mechanical or robotic, or something to do with that. But on the other hand, I was able to use traditional techniques in painting in order to bring those things to life. So it allowed me the freedom to work with really traditional means of painting to bring out completely artificial subject matter.
Great. So we're still in the 90s, or end of the 90s. You've been commissioned to do the costume scenography for a piece of music, for a ballet that was performed by the Ballet de Monte Carlo in 2000. And so here is, in the exhibition, we have this watercolor that is I assume one of many studies you made for it. It's somewhat different from the other works you were doing at that time.
It was different because I was invited to come and go down to Monte Carlo, work with the Ballet de Monte Carlo. And the first thing I realized was I've got to go to the atelier, which is where the dancers work, and just sit there and watch the director, Jean-Christophe Maillot, how he works with his dancers. and kind of get an idea of how to really life studies again of dancers. And, they're kind of like situated in a glass cube where their hand can only go so high and only so far. And then if you take the cube away, they are in this space where they retain their positions in space until they meet with one another. And so most of the time I was there studying the exercises and just watching them and watching him tell them, no, you don't do it like this, you do it like that. And so also the curtain for the ballet, which is what you see over there, this is a long history of the Ballet Russe, which Diaghilev had started. And so the original studio of Diaghilev, which is where the ballet dancers were practicing and working, was now just an empty giant room. So they had the curtain laid out on the floor. It's the rideau de scène, as it's known. And so most of the artists would hand in a small study and then ask somebody to go ahead and put this giant 40-foot thing together. And I decided I wanted to paint the whole thing myself.
This is the one you painted?
So that's the one I painted. So I basically had to lay it out on a floor and wear socks and sort of not try to mess up my lines and go through it. I thought a lot about the way when I remembered Keith Haring working on the big murals he was doing in the hospitals and things like that with lines and whatever. And so it was a real traditional kind of thing. And so that at one point I asked him, could you just hang it for me once? And so I can look at it from up there and see what it looks like. And I felt like it wasn't really complete. So they brought it back, they unrolled it. I kept working on it more. And then finally, I felt like it was complete. It had a joyous sort of dance-like aspect to it. I'd captured some of the legs and the ballet shoes and everything of the dancers, as well as the abstraction of what Meredith Monk, she was the composer. She had written a piece called Opus 40. And so it was for that I did it. And then they asked me to then do the scenes, the scenography, and it was more like a Richard Serra kind of, in a weird way, inspired. It was a silver metallic set, and all the dancers had costumes that were kind of based on the colors of macarons that you see in France, pink and this and that. But what I didn't know was that you never put the prima ballerina in yellow. Apparently yellow is a very bad color for dancers. It's a dangerous color. And they said, that you never put a dancer in yellow. And so I said, really? I didn't know that. I mean, it looks good, but the prima ballerina said, no, I want to wear the yellow. And so she wore the yellow, and nothing bad happened. Everything went great. And they continue to this day they performed it all over the world, in China and everywhere. And they're going to re-perform it in, I guess it's around May 4th or 5th. They haven't done it for 20-something years or whenever it was done. And they're going to do it again.
With all the same
with the original
costumes?
Yeah, with the original costumes, the original sets and everything. And it's going to be coincidental with the exhibition that I'm going to have in Monaco.
Great, terrific.
Yeah,
we all have to go there. So now we have in the exhibition a few drawings of beautiful women, but those poor women there are some weird, freakish creatures sort of sneaking behind their back.
Always sort of looming behind the serenity of all of us is some sort of dark, and this is where I think my idea about psychological cubism started, when I started to think that, you can see many different aspects of the psyche simultaneously. And I also thought about this book by Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus, where there was always somebody sort of speaking in the ear of the composer. And so these were somewhat based on that, where they're, somewhat complacent, placid, reading a book or just sitting on a chair and whatever. And behind them is this ghoulish, sort of odd figure that's haunting them.
So it's a materialization of what's in their mind. Is that the idea?
I think it's just the idea of being haunted, to a certain degree, and not wanting to, the idea that behind all of our happiness, there is the absence and existential sort of absence of the sort of haunting, what you don't want to be unhappy about. While you're happy, you're also being happy against what you don't want to be happy about. And I think there you can see that this woman certainly doesn't want to be unhappy about that character behind her, and neither does that one.
Yeah, so this is always around the idea of representing the mental states rather than just doing a portrait of someone.
I would say so.
And another group of characters that you have in your drawings and paintings are some of those waiters, butlers that you encountered mostly when living in a hotel in Paris.
Yes.
So there is Rodrigo, Jean-Louis, Jean-Louis' girlfriend.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit more about Rodrigo.
Well, I was in a hotel, and I lived in hotels for 10 years, not more. I mean, when I got to New York, I lived in a hotel in Times Square. And then this was in like 79. And then when I got to Paris, of course, I lived in hotels. And one night, they all had these kind of red coats and black lapels or whatever. And one night, I kind of heard, all these glasses clinking. And I opened the door, and I just saw this stumbling, drunken waiter just drop everything on the floor and just everything splat. And it was a good character for me. It was sort of like being in Paris, thinking of the literature, thinking of Molière, thinking of all these writers Balzac, that write about these unfortunate characters that are somewhat comic and tragic at the same time. So Rodrigo, and this one's called Rodrigo and de Chirico because, strangely enough, I just did this sort of profile of de Chirico in the midst of this Rodrigo with the proliferating number of heads next to him. And then that painting is more, minus de Chirico, but just like the paintings were more succinct and a bit more wild, a bit more free, strokes and whatever. And
which is often what happens between your drawings and your paintings. The paintings tend to become more wild or more
I think that, when you're painting, you go, often people think, the studies for paintings are done in advance of the painting. But quite often the paintings are done and parts of the paintings are done. And then you sit down and you've got your sketchbook and you sort of draw out this, that, the other thing and think, okay, that's what I'm going to do with this painting. I don't want to go up to the canvas because the oil paint's wet and just start making a mess on it. So I draw, and then I think, okay, that's what I want to do. And then I go up and start, applying those studies to the paintings.
Right.
So it's really important to me, drawing.
At the same time, so this is a study, but you also worked it really as a drawing. You made something particular to the background. You covered you used some kind of cardboard. I think it's the back of a sketchbook, actually.
Yeah.
And then you covered it with gesso mixed with sand.
Well, I went out, I thought about textural, getting a little bit more texture for the pencil or the charcoal to attach itself to. So I bought this gesso and I bought this sand, and then I mixed the two together, and I had seen it before, in stucco sort of frescoes and things like that, and I just thought maybe I should try that. So that's what that is. I just gessoed it over with the sand and gesso, and then I drew that one on there.
Were you practicing that method in order to then use it with paintings as well?
I tried it on the paintings. It was a bit complicated. it wasn't as easy as working with the drawings, because with the drawings you could get the grisaille type technique where you could draw and then use the white chalk to accentuate the highlights.
So the painting is just one of many paintings of Rodrigo's. They all go in series. Here's
Yeah,
Jean-Louis.
there's a lot of them. He continued throughout. He continued his life cycle, you know.
Same thing with Jean-Louis.
And there's Jean-Louis.
How did you come up with the name Jean-Louis for all those butlers?
Well, Jean-Louis is like a guy that would work at the Café Flore, you know, that would come out and bring you a coffee or bring you a glass of wine or a croissant or whatever. And so they all seem to have the same similar kind of personality, especially when you're an American. You know, they treat you like, you know, you're somewhat like, you know, I don't know. Let's just say I went into a place once and I asked for steak frites. And I remember the waiter came over and I said, "Would you mind if I had some ketchup?" And he looked at me and he said, "Ketchup?" I said, "Yeah, could I have some ketchup with my French fries?" He said, "No." And I said, "I can't have any ketchup?" And he said, "No, no." And I said, "But what about all the other people in the restaurant? How come every single one of the other people have ketchup?" And then he brought me the ketchup. And I love the strangeness of those kind of characters. I feel like the oddity of them is what makes them characters for me. I mean, I think it's like, you know, a writer, they develop a character, and then that character goes through various phases of life in the novel.
Right.
So there he is.
There he is.
There is.
And so he has a whole family. He has
a whole
girlfriend,
family.
He has a mother. There is a grandmother. There is a mother's sister. There is.
Yeah. In fact, you know, that's the French maid, and that's Jean-Louis' grandmother, and I think that's
Another
the
French maid.
maid too. And there are studies, which is what we have in the museum,
Exactly.
for all of these paintings. And what I wanted to do was create a sort of Brooklyn Bridge out of the arm. You know, I wanted to get that perspective and sort of construct it in such a way that it would have that, I don't know, like, I don't know how else to describe it except a Brooklyn Bridge, and just to get the shadow under the arm and this and that. So the studies were really designed around figuring out how to do that, because it was a little tricky, because since people don't have arms like that, and I had to develop it myself and make it realistic and make it the realistic representation of what was going through my mind.
And once you figured it out, you made quite a bunch of them.
Yeah, and there's a whole series of them.
Right. Again, another drawing in the exhibition, which is related to many paintings, but here's one, maybe the closest. And again, you see the difference. The drawing is a bit more classical, in fact, more tame. And in the painting, you go a bit wilder with the shoulders, with even the hands, sort of crab-like. So those were, you never had a model posing to do these kind of works?
No, I never worked again for models after a certain point, you know. I mean, probably not for at least 10 or 15 years or so before that. And I just wanted to come up with an idea of a very simple concept of a woman sitting in a chair, and without the ghosts and the ghouls behind her. And so this was a very, I would say, straightforward drawing of what it was that I wanted to make sure that I got that in the painting, even though you see the circles there, which are kind of the cushions of the chair. And so those are sort of, there's a somewhat of an abstract realist aspect to these paintings. Like you said, there's a bit of a distortion, if you could call it that, in the paintings.
Yeah, especially in the face.
Yeah.
Something different, also in the exhibition. So this is also a series of drawings and paintings that you did based on Looney Tunes cartoons, imagery.
Yeah. Excuse me for a sec here. Yeah, Aaron over here, my daughter's husband, he bought me a book on Looney Tunes and the art of Tex Avery and everyone. And I started looking at them again and thinking, these would be great pieces to work from and abstract, because I thought all of what everybody says about my work, it's all derived from European old masters, and it's all derived from this, that, the other thing. I thought, well, I want to start to work from American culture and abstract it to a certain degree. So this is an abstracted Looney Tune sort of mashup between the rooster and the, I don't even remember the names of the characters themselves.
Woody Woodpecker? No.
What's it called?
I think we came up after trying.
Oh yeah, Woody Woodpecker and
after trying to
Woody
identify the
Woodpecker
figures, we
and
came
the
up
rooster,
with Foghorn Longhorn
Yeah.
and Woody Woodpecker.
Yeah, and then there's this sort of piece of yellow paper that I collaged onto it that had these black lines. So that went with the beak, and I thought of the rooster, and I thought, I like the idea of I then started a whole, group of paintings which I call, in my mind, the American wing, okay, which are all either TV characters, cartoon characters, jazz record covers that I would have liked to have made for all my favorite jazz musicians. So I just made covers in homage to each one of them, like whether it was Billie Holiday. I made a cover that felt like, oh, this would have been a great cover for Billie Holiday. This would have been a good one for Charlie Parker. This would have been a great one for John Lewis. This would have been a great one for Bud Powell. And so with the cartoons, I worked with Daffy Duck. I worked with, all of them, Bugs Bunny. And because in the beginning, people described my work as Rembrandt meets Bugs Bunny. So I said, okay, I get it, It's like, I got it. But why don't I just start going the other way around? Bugs Bunny meets Rembrandt, and start trying it from that angle. So that, in that case, and so this is just like, American culture with American, being American. I mean, I thought, okay, I've been living in Paris for so long. I finally got back from Paris, and I wanted to start just working from, what was in our own.
Yeah, but it's also Daffy Duck or whoever.
Yeah, what I grew up with. I liked watching cartoons when I was a kid. I really enjoyed it.
What I mean is you were also mixing it with a more abstract expressionist kind of approach. So
well, I felt
low.
like when I was a kid, to be honest, I was very serious about drawings and painting. Like those early drawings. I was very serious, and I felt like my mission was to become a really serious artist, and I did a lot of realistic studies of things like fish and dinosaurs and, I don't know, all kinds of different things, figures and whatever. And then I finally had read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and I had started reading other kinds of books, and that's what led me to those paintings like Entrance to the Mind and drawings of that nature, and took 10 years until I got to the expanding canvases. But those were completely done. That whole period of work was, that cycle had been completed. What had never been approached was the idea of our own cultural sort of, I guess you could say, recognizable cultural content. I wanted to abstract that.
Mm-hmm. So these characters are standing in the exhibition next to this woman with pearl, in one of those examples of the eclecticism of your work. And so she has a characteristic that is often in your works of mismatched eyes.
Yes. But she's, in my mind, I mean, so coming back around to Renaissance music, I started to get back into the idea of, as a hobby, to come back around and start to play Renaissance music. And many of the songs that are written for lute and vocalist, I worked with Anthony Roth Costanza a lot. And he would come over and we'd have a lot of fun playing John Dowland songs. And most of them were like, I Saw My Lady Weep, or, I can't even remember, Crystal Tears, for example. And they're beautiful songs, okay? They're absolutely beautiful songs. And so I felt like this was a sort of melancholic, and they're all based on a idea of melancholia. And so this is a sort of, for me, a melancholic figure, regardless of the, sort of up and down of where her eyes are placed. But there's a certain degree of melancholia in my mind to this piece. And this is exactly the period when I started beginning to play again music.
Uh-huh.
I dropped it for a long time. When they told me in school, what do you really want to do? Because you've got to think of something. And I thought, I really want to do art, but I'm studying music because I like it so much, but I don't want to do it. I don't really want to be a musician. I don't think I have a chance of ever sitting on stage and playing a classical, performance, but I might have a crack at being in a museum. If I'm lucky, I'll get into a museum, but I'm never going to make it to Carnegie Hall. I was sure about that.
You might have made it, but we are happy you decided to go with the painting. But, and we're moving along, and this is the last slide. So you're going back to Cubism, in fact, where you started, and that's when you started developing this whole idea of psychological Cubism, of which these are really beautiful examples. So you want to explain a little bit how you developed that concept?
Well, it was the idea that, I've said it before, in print, but, the original idea of Cubism, which was to see a single object from multiple perspectives. So, for example, a violin or a teapot or something of that nature, and see it from every angle all at once at the same time on the canvas. And I thought, what about the human personality? What about the emotional interior of the person that we're looking at? Like, what they look like is one thing, but what they're thinking and what they're feeling and how many different emotions they may have simultaneously is a whole different story. And so that's why, for lack of a better term, I called it psychological cubism, because I thought you're seeing a person from the point where there's joy, there's grief, there's happiness, there's sorrow, there's, victory, there's defeat, there's all these different emotions and different things that go through somebody's head and somebody's life at the same time. So when I look at a person or I invent a person, I completely empathize with those figures on all those different levels of their emotional content, as opposed to just simply what they look like. I want to get into the sort of their face reflects their mind.
So what are the emotions of the businessman?
The businessman's emotions are pretty screwed up. It looks like he was out there and thought he had a deal, and maybe it didn't quite work out.
Well,
like a lot of these businessmen. I don't know. I just thought that he was a good example because he's got a suit and tie and he's all ready to go, but yet he's scrambled and he's got a number of different sort of fractured images and parts of his face, like one eye is looking at you quite seriously in the middle, and then a number of the other ones are sort of all over the place. And I thought, he's just losing it during his sort of presentation of some sort. That was an idea.
Thank you for the interpretation. So we are done. Is there anything you want to say as a conclusion? Something we haven't said that you want to say about your drawing practice? Or?
I would just say thank you to Isabelle for such a great job that we did together working to put the collection, and to Colin for allowing us to have this exhibition at this time, and to everybody here, my children, and great inspirations to me, to all my friends, all the people that I work with, Christopher, the donors who made this possible, that these works would be in this, exhibition. Garrett, Elizabeth, who I work with very closely, and everyone who's here. And just to say thanks for coming and listening.
Thank you.